Steve Carr, welcome.
Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm very well, but I must admit I'm suffering from severe envy of backdrop.
Oh,
For context, we're recording this amidst COVID-19, and I have tried to do the best with what I've got here, but wow, that looks, and also it will form part of the story when we come on to talk about it. So. No,
yeah.
I'm really grateful that you've taken the time to speak to the Wellity community about something that's very close to your heart, which is your journey. And over to you, Steve, in your own words, tell us why we're here today.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me on to have a chat with your community. I feel honoured to be here today to share some of my story with your listeners. And the reason why I'm here today is, in short, I shouldn't be. You see, just 5 years ago, I experienced a nervous breakdown whilst I was at work. Unfortunately, there were no such thing as mental health first aiders or employer assistance program back in 2014. And so whilst I experienced this nervous breakdown at work, I couldn't really tell anybody what it was about. So subsequently, I was signed off work with work-related stress for a month. And on my return, I was placed on a performance improvement plan. Placed on this performance improvement plan, and within a month, I was managed out of the business. Like I say, there was no such thing as mental health first aiders or support that I could go to because I couldn't tell them the truth. Now, we'll come back to that in just a moment about the truth. In hindsight, it was probably the best thing that they could have done. However, for me at the time, I couldn't see this. I was angry, I was agitated, I was furious. And in that same month, I attempted to take my life by suicide on 3 separate occasions. It was then I knew that I had to reach out for help. I had to ask for professional intervention. And it was at that point that I was diagnosed with borderline PTSD, high functioning anxiety, work-related stress, depression, addiction, and underlying unresolved childhood trauma. So I think it would be for the benefit of your listeners that we need to go back to the beginning.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot to take in there. In my own head, I want to, I suppose, understand what led to that point, what led to the breakdown, how it personified itself. Were there any red flags leading up to it? I could go on. So yeah, take us back. Where did it all start?
Sure. Well, it all started in late 80s. So I was born in 1976 in sunny Swindon. So that's a little town in between Reading and Bristol. And I grew up on a council estate. It was an extremely rough council estate. And there was myself and 2 other siblings, my elder brother Paul, who was a year older than me, and my younger sister Claire. My father was the only parent working. He was a mechanic by trade, a hard-working chap. I had great admiration for my father. I wanted to be a mechanic all through my childhood. And times were difficult back in the late 80s when I was growing up and going to school. And everything was a hand-me-down from my brother. And I just remember the winters were extremely cold and extremely difficult. And I remember my little sister, she used to have this, it was a kitchen, and it also had like a shop front on it as well. And it used to have these plastic 50p pieces, and they were exactly the same size as the 50p meter that, you know, for the electric. So my mum used to put the 50p pieces into the electric, and every time that we were due at rebates, this is what used to happen back then, we get these plastic 50p pieces back, and the electric man said, are these yours? And every time my parents used to say, don't know where they come from. So things were tough back then. And I just remember it was always a struggle. We had very little money, things were tight. If we could get by managing things, repairing things. My father would do that kind of thing. He was a great mechanic, but also he was used to, just upcycling and recycling things. So that was our way of doing things. When I was 15 years old, I remember this day and I remember it well. 15 years old, and my brother was 16. He was out to work and I was still in school. And I remember the morning, the very last morning that I would see him, and it was stuck in my mind forever, just quite simply because we used to share a bedroom. We used to share a lot of time together, even though we were complete polar opposites. He was into heavy metal and I was into rave music, so we were complete polar opposites on the music spectrum. So I thought he was odd, and likewise he too thought I was something quite special. That morning, Friday the 13th of September 1991, just before he left for work, he said to me, "Steve, I'm going to visit my girlfriend this evening on Acres Way," which was a notoriously long stretch of road in Swindon that a lot of people used to race down. And he used to be into motorbikes, so he used to go down there racing his bike down there. But his girlfriend lived there. And he said to me, "Steve, would you like to come and meet my girlfriend?" And I just remember saying, "I'd love to. I've got plans this evening, so no, I won't be coming to meet you." And that was it. He went off to work. I went off to school. Average day, normal day. Thought nothing more of it. Come home from school. He had already come and gone. And I remember going out. So I'd made my plans that evening. And I went out and then came back that evening. And I came back at about 7 o'clock. Came back at 7, and I just can picture what happened now. Is my father, as soon as I entered the door, my father was pacing up and down. And I thought that was odd. He never does this. He used to watch things like Krypton Factor, and on a Friday evening come home and chill out. And this was odd. Something was wrong. So I asked, "What's going on?" He said, "It's your brother." He said, "He was down Acres Way this evening. I've just heard on the news that there's been an accident down there." So he left, and he went to go and see if he could find my brother. He came back an hour later with no news. All he said was, the police have cordoned off the area. There's about 25 police cars, 2 ambulances, the fire brigade, and the air ambulance had arrived. So, okay, so we're all worried at this point. 1 hour would go past and we still heard nothing. So it's now 8 o'clock at night. 9 o'clock comes round and we still heard nothing. My brother's supposed to be home at 10 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. And my father answered. There was 2 police officers stood at the door. And I just remember it vividly when one of the police officers said, "Mr. and Mrs. Carr." And we knew instantly then what they were about to say. "Mr. and Mrs. Carr, I'm afraid to tell you, your son Paul has been killed in a car accident." That car accident that night happened as follows. It was 2 young gentlemen in their 20s, had been out drinking and decided to drive home afterwards. They decided to drive home and race each other on the same road as where a bench with 5 young children, the youngest at 7 and the eldest at 16, were all sat. The 2 cars were racing, and there's a roundabout opposite where the children were sat, racing each other side by side, and the car decides to come out of the roundabout, pulling out of the industrial estate. One of the car in front sees it, puts on the brakes, and the car behind fishtails, hits it, doesn't stop, but flips, comes off of the road, mounts the bench and rolls over all 5 children and killed all of them by my brother outright. We were not told until 11 o'clock at night, and it happened at 7 o'clock in the evening. We will all remember that day for the rest of our lives because it completely shocked the community. it was devastating. One, for the fact that we were not told until almost 5 hours later, but two, because a little afterwards we were asked if we wanted counselling, professional help, and my father said no. He said no because, if you can remember back to 1991, if you were to ask for professional help or sought counselling or anything to do with mental health, can you remember the stigma that was around asking for help about mental health back then?
Yes, I can.
I think it wasn't just this, though. There were many things that were going on for my father in his past that he didn't want to ask for help. He was the kind of chap that said, no, it's okay, I'll deal with this. He was too proud to ask for help. And again, back in that time, it was just frowned upon. So we didn't get any help. We didn't get any professional help. And it was that event that would come out in me 25 years later.
Steve, it really, really moved me, that story, but for the obvious reasons that your brother was involved and so many others were involved and lost their life that day. But, you know, when I go back to your term hand-me-downs, I remember fondly, I've got two brothers myself, one older and one younger. And when you were talking, I was imagining it was one of those and the dreadful events that unfolded after that. So it just really, really hit home with me and struck a chord.
Yeah. And do you know what? I think for many of us that are around my age now, in my 40s, I think, you know, we can transport ourselves back to that period in the late 80s when winters were winters, summers were summers. You know, times were tough back then for many people. You know, and there'd be many people that were listening to this that, you know, that they're only one parent was out to work in. You know, there'll be many people that can relate to the struggle back in the late 80s. And
tell us what happened in the next 20 odd years, you said 25 years, that how did it raise itself again? But more importantly, how did you deal with it? How did you come to terms with it? You may not have come to terms, or how did you move on?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think what happened next is, again, is quite common for us guys to do what happened to me next. So I buried all those feelings, I buried all of those emotions, and I masked all of the unknown trauma that had gone on at that particular point with substance abuse. So I found a life of drink and drugs and hedonism from the age of 15 until just 5 years ago. So I was self-medicating because I didn't want to deal with the traumatic upbringing that I had. I didn't want to deal with the trauma of losing my brother. And so I masked it for many years, and it would all come about from that event. But what I chose to do, the reason why I chose to mask it, is because, again, I was never shown how to ask for help or told how I could ask for help. So what I did was what I knew. What I did was what I was taught, which was I need to be proud, I need to man up, I need to deal with these things on my own, as opposed to saying, you know what, if I was able or knew how to ask for help, I would have. But I wouldn't be in this position today if I had asked for that help. So what I chose to do is every weekend, I used to go out, and I used to be quite a socialite, and I would just hide things with the drink and the drugs, but I could never hold down any serious type of relationship. I could never hold down any form of long-winded job, just quite simply because as soon as people started asking questions about me, I felt threatened. So I would leave. I didn't want them knowing what was going on underneath all the real Steve, because in all honesty, I didn't know who the real Steve was. So I wouldn't let people get close to me. As soon as they started asking questions, I would push them away. So this would happen until I was 39 years of age.
Again, there's a lot I want to cover because we're about the same age, and I go straight forward to, is this a generation thing? Are there loads of 40-year-olds now who perhaps haven't been taught to deal with this the right way, or any way to do it.
And that's that's another good point. If we go back to our childhood and we look at the education that we had in school, were emotions covered? Were general living covered? Did we learn this from our parents? Probably not, because they didn't know. And what we have to realize is the education that we had, 9 times out of 10, was just passed down generation to generation. So if we look at our generation and the next generation is completely different to ours. The next generation is acceptance, and they understand emotions, the power of emotion, the power of being able to ask for help, not being frightened to help, because we've educated them that way. Ours came from our parents, that came from their grandparents, that came from their parents, and so on and so forth. And it was a case of, no, you can deal with things on your own. But it would be amazing now, and I'd love to see the statistics around this, that how many people are actually out there struggling with some kind of mild trauma. Because I'm sure that there would be more than, that we could put a figure to. Just quite simply because, again, that us in our age, we couldn't ask for help easily, and it was frowned upon. We were looked at, we were scared of being locked up. We were scared of being called mad, or, all those stigmatizing names that stopped people from actually going asking for help.
And that, I think, is the biggest blocker now. And if it even crosses your mind that there may be some negative outcome for talking about it, immediately shuts down any hard work that's been done by someone. Have you, since you've sort of accepted that you can talk about it, etc., have you seen a psychologist, or have you got a coach?
Good question. We'll come on to that in just a moment. So I think more of the story needs to feed into yes was the answer to both of those. And yes, I've had many types of therapy, which, I'm grateful for. Had I not found it, I don't think I would be here today. But the reason why I did find that is because I asked for help. So when my doctor gave me the diagnosis of, the borderline PTSD, high functioning anxiety, stress, depression, underlying childhood trauma, I then had a choice. And that choice was I could take the standard medicalized route of medication, or I choose the hard way of finding out what actually happened and address the root cause. So I took the most difficult route, and that was finding out what happened to me and what then, as a result of that, how that played out in my future. So yes, I'd seen the psychologist. Yes, I'd seen the counsellor. I'd gone through NLP. I'd gone through hypnotherapy. I'd gone through coaching. I used 13 different types of intervention to find out what happened. And the reason why I chose that is because I was at a point in my life where I didn't know where to go. So the final suicide attempt, I had a choice: to stay at home and watch Jeremy Kyle and comatose myself even more, which really wasn't a great option, or walk the entire length of Britain in recovery, finding out what help was available for me and others experiencing a similar situation.
Steve, you said then the last attempt. Can we rewind? And I think it was me asking you about the psychologist that may have interrupted your flow. That was the last attempt. I mean, crikey, how did you, my heart goes out to you, how did you even get to that point? Where did that whole thing start? Sure.
Okay, so we go back to 2008. I'm going to take you back to 2008, and I don't know if you can remember back in 2008 what happened to the economy.
Recession?
Absolutely. And in that recession, that was the time I bought my very first house. So in 2008, I bought my very first house, and life was great. I was a business development manager for Unilever, had a fabulous partner, had my first house, had a little savings into the bank. And in that very same year, I met some people whilst I was out, because I was a bit of a socialite. And I wasn't really doing too much of the drugs at this point, probably just smoking a little bit of pot at weekends. But one particular night I remember going out, and somebody approached me and said, oh, Steve, yeah, you buy your pot from a friend of mine. Just wondered if you wanted to try this. And it was some white powder. And that white powder was cocaine. And I remember trying a line of this cocaine and thinking, wow, oh my gosh, that's good. And from that one line, I just became addicted to cocaine. So that one line on a Saturday night turned into a gram on a Saturday night. Then a gram turned into a gram on a Saturday night to a Sunday night. And it would progress until I was taking a gram of cocaine every single night after work. So I was a functioning addict. So I was still going out to work. I was still earning, but as soon as I come home, that was it. I was searching for that high, I guess. There was a void in my life that needed filling, and I found it with taking the cocaine. So after a period of time, that 1 gram of cocaine progressed. It progressed into a habit that was costing me £100 a day. After 8 months of owning my house, I stopped paying the mortgage. I pushed all my friends away because I didn't want them to know what my dirty little secret was. I pushed all my family away until I became a recluse. I started selling every object in my house. It was pretty much a bachelor pad. I had literally everything, new gadget, new toy in. And I sold everything. I sold everything in that house, even the blinds in the window, until I received a repossession letter from my mortgage company, which I had to put into the window. Now, my house was on a main commuter route into town, which all my friends pass every day. And they seen this, and I was so embarrassed that I wouldn't answer their calls, I wouldn't answer the door. And I was in my house, sold everything until I was on the floor in just a sleeping bag. That was until I was told I was being evicted within 2 weeks. When I received that eviction notice, that 2 weeks went by very quickly, and because I couldn't reach out to anyone, I became homeless and lived on the streets. And that is where it all began to unfold.
And like any drug, it's not just the fact that it was hurting your wallet. Psychologically, you probably felt you let yourself down, dirty, useless, everything else that I know we've spoken about before. So it's not just the physical or the financial. You must have been really hurting at that point.
Gosh, absolutely. Yeah. That little voice in my mind was saying how much of a waste of space I was. It was saying that I was useless. You're absolutely correct. It got to the point where it was saying the best thing I could do right now was probably end life. And I'd always have suicide ideation, but I would never see it through because I thought there's got to be better. I've got to come through this. How though? But this would actually continue until, like I say, 5 years ago. That period that I was living on the streets, I was only there for a very short period before an old friend seen me and took me in. I didn't tell him what was going on, but he did help me back onto my feet until I was working again. But again, the same patterns would reoccur. So I was working as a business development manager, again, until 5 years ago for a very large organization. And that was when it all came to a head. It was at the age of 39, everything that had happened in my past just snuck up on me and said, I can't deal with hiding this any longer. This mask that I'm putting on every day, this facade needs to stop. And that was when the breakdown happened.
Were you still on the drugs at the time?
Yes. Yeah.
And the worst thing, I mean, we both love the sales industry. The thing about the sales industry, though, is that when you are down, you don't just have to go in and turn up at a point of normal. You have to go in and turn up at a point of superhero in order to get your message across and do well at sales. And that difference is completely exhausting sometimes if you're not in the right frame of mind yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, you're having to put this face on every single day, matching the person that you were when you had your best sale, regardless of what's gone on underneath. So, I wasn't hitting any of my targets. I was worried about where I was living. So everything that was going on for me at the time, so everything that happened in the past, I was carrying, work blissfully unaware of what was going on in my life. And I couldn't tell them because there was nobody there trained to talk to. So I'm carrying all of this past and trying to be this person that I'm not, while struggling with, oh gosh, I've got nowhere to live. What do I do this weekend? I'm still doing the drugs. I've got no money. I can't afford to put petrol into a car that work have given me. And it all came to a head. There was so much going on for me that I completely shut down.
Sounds like there was a ticking time bomb.
Absolutely. And it was. I just couldn't deal with life as I knew it.
Oh, well, look, when was the first sign of it? We'll talk us through that day from start to finish when it must have crept up, because there will be many people watching this thinking and wondering whether this is happening to them at the moment.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I remember going to work when I had the breakdown, and like I said, there was an awful lot going on for me. And I realized that very morning I was in such financial trouble because where I'd lost the house, I was in negative equity. What I'd forgotten to mention was I had taken £20,000 equity out of the house before I lost it and spent on cocaine. So I was £20,000 in negative equity of the house that I had to pay back that I'd lost. The place that I was sharing currently with somebody, they'd left at that same day. So I had to pay the rent for them too. Everything that was going on, and I couldn't face any more that day. The car had ran out of fuel. I wasn't hitting my targets. I was completely stressed. I wasn't focusing on work. I couldn't see the wood for the trees. And then all I was thinking was, if I buy enough alcohol and drugs this evening, I wonder if I could end this. I didn't want life to end as I knew it. I just wanted the pain to stop. And I thought the easiest way to do this without hurting anyone else was an overdose. And so I went out and bought enough drugs that day and alcohol. And like I say, the final attempt, there was 3 attempts on the final attempt to make sure that I wouldn't live.
And you bought a concoction of everything? Had you thought this through?
Yes, yeah, I thought it through. I planned it out, and I kind of put everything in order that day. Put my affairs in order. I was at peace with, I knew what I wanted to do. After experiencing the nervous breakdown that day, whilst in work, I knew that morning that I wanted to do it. I was unaware that I'd experienced a breakdown that day too, but I knew at that point that was it. That was a sign that I needed to end everything, that I wanted my life to end. There was no other way out.
Steve, I've heard people talking about nervous breakdowns, but what is it? And what happened? How did it personify itself to you?
Sure. Well, it personified itself in the way that I was in cash and carry, and there was one person that said what I potentially thought was the wrong thing at the time. They were not offering a refund. I was working for a cigarette manufacturer at the time. I had to take them back to make sure that all my books balanced for sales, and they wouldn't take them back. And at that point, we got into a heated debate, then into an argument, and that was it. I couldn't think, and I just collapsed onto the floor crying, and I couldn't speak. I just stopped, and I thought, it felt like I was going to have a heart attack. My head felt like it was going to explode. I just collapsed.
Wow. You telling that story, I can relate to it. You just thought, do you know what? I cannot. All your barriers came down, didn't they? It sounds like everything collapsed, and you just thought, do you know what? Have everything, take it, and you lost all power and control. You were quite happy to give power and control over to whoever was around you. Just get me out of this mess.
Yeah, absolutely. I just began to pour with sweat, tunnel vision, and that was it. Next thing I know, I just dropped onto the floor.
And were you out? Were you out cold? What?
No. I just got tunnel vision, dropped onto the floor, just started crying, and one of the sales assistants came over, quickly rushed over, said, should we call an ambulance? I said no, just walk me out to the car. And I sat in my car for the next hour and a half and started crying and just couldn't move.
And had you got the drink and drugs at this point?
No, that was my next move. So I called my supplier and asked him if I could come and see him. And it was at this point that I purchased 24 grams of cat, or meow meow, it was known as then. It was a legal high back then. A bottle of whiskey, half a gram of cocaine, and the legal high spice, and a £10 bag of pop. And that evening I took it back and I consumed all of it within the space of 2 hours.
Sorry, say that again. The whiskey, the
All
bottle of whiskey,
a litre of whiskey,
half a gram.
27 grams of cat, and a bag of pop, and the legal high spice.
So within 2 hours, you must have just been consuming. I dread to even ask this question, but what did that feel like? Aside from the suicide attempt, what?
Yeah.
Did you regret it halfway through once it was all kicking in?
Yes, I did. I can remember this extremely vividly. By the time I was approaching the end of using it all, I just fell back onto my bed. And it felt like I was falling backwards, but going forwards, and it was just a black void. And I just remember seeing my brother, my nan, and there was 2 other figures that I don't know who they were, but I just remember my nan and my brother saying, "Steve, come with us, you'll be fine now, just let go." And then I woke up and then fell back in unconsciousness. And this happened for 8 hours solid. And then the next day, I knew that I needed help. And that was when I reached out again for professional help. Because the first time, I couldn't tell my doctor what was going on.
Steve, I feel pretty bad the next day after a bottle and a half of wine. I mean, what did you feel like? Did you second guess whether you were alive or dead? What was the physical hangover like to that?
Yeah, it was awful. But I had built up my intolerance level so much that clearly that the next day, as much as I felt awful, but I thought, if I've built up my intolerance level this much, what would it take? I need help. So I remember ringing my doctor the very next day and saying, "I need to speak to you. I need an emergency appointment." They asked what it was for. I told them that I attempted to take my life. I was in the very next day, and I just remember sat in my GP's office, and this was the hardest thing I ever had to say was, "I'm a cocaine addict. I need help." And I just burst out crying. And it was at that point she said, "Steve, thank you. Thank you for coming in. Thank you for being here today. That's so brave." And that was the start of my journey of self-awareness, because I'd become so self-aware that something wasn't right, that I needed help, but it took 39 years to get there.
Had you feared what she was going to say when you told her that you were a cocaine addict? And was her reaction such a startle to you that was her positive reaction that gave you confidence in a way to reevaluate everything?
Absolutely. That couldn't be any closer to the truth. When I sat there and I confessed that I was a cocaine addict, and she said, "Thank you for letting me know. That must have been so difficult. Thank you for coming in today." I was shocked. I wasn't expecting that answer. I was expecting to be judged. I was expecting to be ridiculed. I was expected to be beaten down. But I wasn't. It was because I was so frail and I was in this weak position. She could see. I could barely speak. And she knew that I was in a place of suffering. And so she reached out and said, "Thank you." It shocked me at that point, because as soon as I left her office, it was like a weight was lifted off of my shoulders. That I just told somebody about everything that had happened. And she said, "Okay, let's get you some help." I thought, oh gosh, really? I thought there was something more to it. I was a bit dubious, but that was the start of the journey of acceptance. And what she did that day changed my life, because she accepted who I was and what I did.
So Steve, before we move on to the part 2, shall we say, what word of advice would you give to anyone who's struggling with addiction or shame?
Speak to your GP. Speak to your GP, because they are trained to listen. They're trained to be non-judgmental. They are specialists in help. They are the gatekeepers to help. If you can't speak to anyone else, speak to your GP. If you find it difficult to speak to your GP, speak to another GP. Speak to anybody in there, but speak to somebody in that profession that will be able to signpost you to support. Because from my own experience, I thought it would be a bad experience. Now, GPs haven't got the best of reputations when seeing people or being able to refer people on or giving medication. That's not what you're there for. You're there to ask for help. You're there to say, please help me. And they're there to help you. So anybody, and by anybody that is going through some kind of addiction or some kind of struggle, mental health issue, please speak to your GP and be as honest as you can with them, because they are there to help. And they're some of the loveliest people. And like I say, if you can't get one GP, don't stay with that GP if they don't understand you. Move around. You can do this. I know at the time of struggle or at crisis, it seems extremely difficult, but there are, and you can change GPs. So don't be frightened if you don't use your own GP or have a relationship with them or have built rapport, speak to somebody else.
Okay, well, look, if that helps one person, just one person with what you've just said, I'm incredibly proud of you for doing it. And right, so you walk out there, you haven't been told off, you're back in civilization. There are all the, as any addict would say, all the temptations. You're probably battling in your own mind. What happened next?
The first thing I wanted to do, and it was great you pointing that out, was I wanted to have a cigarette, I wanted to have a drink, and I wanted to take a line of Coke. Only I didn't, because I knew if I'd gone back there, that it would probably continue. So because I knew that I had addiction, if I went along that route again, it would only continue. I did carry on smoking for a little while, though. That was something, again, that I gave up 5 years ago, all at once, again, holistically. So what I did at that point was I had a choice, and that was continue with the help or not. But I chose to, because I didn't want to go back ever to that point. So it was at this point I started to explore what help was available for me. Now, this was a couple of months prior to Walking Britain. So at this point, I was staying with a friend, and I was out of work, and I was claiming benefits, and I was just off work. And I wanted to find out what help was available. So I went to my local library and I started reading books. On personal development and self-awareness and what to do in a crisis and how to overcome a crisis. Nervous breakdowns, what trauma was, and what childhood trauma was. So I started researching all of this, and I come up with the idea of going to see what help was available all over England. And so this was a couple of months later. So the nervous breakdown happened at the end of October. Christmas had come and gone, and January was with us. And it was the February of 2016 that I was living with a friend. And like I said, I was claiming benefit. And this Friday afternoon, I was due to be paid a benefit so I could pay my rent. And unfortunately, the benefit hadn't gone in. So it was 4 o'clock Friday afternoon. And so I rang the job centre and said, my benefit hasn't gone in, I can't pay my rent. And they said, okay, what we need you to do is just go back to your doctor, get your sick note, bring it back into us, and we'll pay you within an hour. But gosh, okay, I've got to go quick here and move. That's exactly what I did. Went to my doctor's, got another sick note because they had lost it, handed it in, and they said, great, give us an hour, you'll be paid. So 5 o'clock comes round, and still hadn't been paid. So I thought I'd better jump on the phone to these guys. On the phone from 5 till 5 to 6, and bearing in mind they close at 6. At 5 to 6, somebody picks the phone up, holds for 10 seconds, and hangs up. I'm sat next to my landlady and I have to tell her I can't pay her. She listened, she knew that I was telling the truth, but she also said, I'm sorry, you can't stay here if you can't pay the rent. I thought, oh gosh, well, what can I do? And it was at this point I had in my mind that I was going to Walk Britain the month later, so at the end of March. That very night, I knew I had to pull that forwards a month. So that very same night that she said, you can't afford to live here, I packed everything that I owned, which wasn't a lot at the time, what I was wearing, whatever I could fit into a bag, which was my sleeping bag and tent and a few clothes. And I made my way with my last £100 down to Land's End. And it was there I started my journey, a 90-day journey, walking the entire length of Britain in recovery, raising awareness for both mental health and homelessness and finding out what help was available for me. On that journey, I chose to tell my story to anyone that would listen. So instead of recoiling and saying, I'll deal with this on my own, I actually told my story to ITV, BBC radio stations, and every publicity company in the country that would print my story to say that I was a recovering cocaine addict walking the country, raising awareness for both of the things that I've gone through, both mental health and homelessness. And so this is when I was finding the interventions, so hypnotherapy, NLP, timeline therapy, but the one that got me through was coaching. Because with the doctor's model and what they use for people to get well is simply medication, and they only help people to get well. What they don't do is take people forwards. So a doctor or a nurse practitioner will only take you so far. They will help you to recover. However, it's then down to you to make that journey of, well, how do I go forwards now? And that's where they get stuck, because they're not taught in the coaching methodology.
Steve, I'm at a crossroads with my thinking at the moment. So walking the country and planning requires a clear head, but you didn't have a clear head because you'd just almost been, you'd been chucked out. So were you chucked out, homeless and down, or were you positive, upbeat, I'm going to spread my message?
Great question. And I was positive and upbeat, absolutely. So I thought this is going to be A, the adventure of a lifetime. B, I've got no plan. I didn't have any plans whatsoever. I didn't know how the route. I used my mobile phone every day to just use Google Maps, and I knew I just had to head north. I knew I could walk, and that was it. That's all I needed. So I thought, well, you know what? Let's go and see what happens. I've got no plan. I'm completely confused. I can't put anything on paper because I don't know how to do this. Let's just go and do it.
Do you know what? There are plenty of times when I actually like being lost on a walk, because it's so rare nowadays, what with GPS and everyone knowing where you are and what you're doing. If you're lost and you've actually got to figure it out, I find that really refreshing. When you're walking around, you say you didn't need anything else. You needed food and a place to stay. How did you get all that?
Excellent. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is we need just the basics. Something to eat, something to drink, food, shelter, safety, water. So I have my tent, so I knew I had somewhere to stay. Okay, that's that done. So I've got £100. Now this is what I didn't foresee, is how long it would last. It actually lasted the entire journey, because I thought, well, if I'm going to find out what help is available for homeless and people that are struggling with their mental health, where do I go to find this? Well, I went to soup kitchens every evening. And what I would do to make sure that I was okay and being fed, and to make sure that I had enough food, was I would go and serve at a soup kitchen every single night. So for 90 days, I would approach a soup kitchen, let them know what I was doing, but say, if I help and serve, if there's anything left, if there's any food, would you mind if I have some? They said, why aren't you just taking some? You're homeless and you're struggling. I said, that isn't how it works. I said, I need to deal with my own inner demons too. And the way that I'm able to do that is if I serve. So if I was able to serve, that would help me. And I would then get talking to them, and then I would ask them what was local in their town for people struggling with their mental health. And the next day, after a good night's sleep in the tent, I would then go and approach the organisations that were helping people with their mental health. So what I did to stay well and focused was I had 2 focuses for each day, and that was one, needed to walk to the next town or city, but I approached 2 organisations, one helping people that were homeless, and 2 helping people with their mental health. So I had something to do every single day. It was keeping my mind off of the drugs, off of everything else, and creating this new thought pattern of positivity and knowing that I was doing something every day.
Were you ever tempted?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So that was strength of mind then?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thoughts come back all the time. And so they're always there of, do you remember this? Yeah, absolutely. But do you remember what happened when you done them? Yeah. And that feeling was a lot worse than the feeling of feeling good. So for me, what I had to deal with at that point, because those feelings were coming back an awful lot, is where did they come from? Okay, so it came from trauma. It stemmed from trauma. So what did I need from that? Well, there was a lack of connection between my parents when I was younger. And so what I found out from this was that trauma and lack of connection, I needed that connection elsewhere. So I found that connection in drugs because it gave the same feeling as love. So what the drugs were releasing into my brain were dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, epinephrine. And so that was exactly the same feeling as when we're told we're loved, when we're hugged. As children, that connection that we have, I didn't have. So I found that in drugs.
Now you were walking the streets and putting the tent up, I imagine, in fields. You must have had plenty of experiences, let's put it that way, because you were in a different community. You were sleeping rough. There would have been alcohol and drugs involved with others. Sorry.
Yeah.
What was the lowest point of that?
The lowest point was when I reached Birmingham. Now I'd made some friends at this point that connected me to a homeless charity that feed the homeless in the centre of Birmingham every single evening. And I remember walking into Birmingham, I could hear this loud music playing, so I knew it was them in the centre of town. And there were rows of tables. There must have been about 10 rows of tables and about 6 deep. And I just remember each table had people serving the homeless, and there were hundreds of homeless people waiting to get fed. And as soon as I seen this, it just hit me for 6. I thought, oh gosh, all these homeless people. I've never seen so many in one place being fed. And it hurt. And it hurt to see that many homeless people. And I met my connection that night, and they said, Steve, take as much food as you need. We've put you up in a hotel. And I said, can we stop? I said, I need to help you. Let me help you. We'll talk at the end. And it was a Sikh organisation. And for me at that time, my faith had helped me through as well. And it was something that I found. So, personally for my own God was helping me through and guiding me at the time. And I found the Sikh community were also so forgiving and just beautiful people, and the messages that they were sharing, the compassion and love that they were giving the homeless. And I remember we finished late in the evening, and the Sikh organisation took me to their Sikh temple, and we sat down and we ate all together. And it was the first ever time that I'd been in the Sikh temple, and it was the most amazing experience to sit down with people that just said, Steve, what you're doing is so unbelievable. Thank you. Thank you for doing what you do. I felt so humbled.
So you had your lowest moment, and then that led to you appreciating one of your best moments then.
Gosh, yeah.
Let me ask you this, with your faith as an outsider, how do you balance up your faith with what happened to your brother?
Yeah, that was a good question. because I didn't believe in any God when that happened to my brother. I didn't believe in anything, any higher power or source, until the final suicide attempt. And on that very evening, I think one of those figures may have been a God per se. And so it was for me, that just brought an awareness about that there was this higher power, that there was something there. And I believed from that night going forwards that something saved me. And so I actually started going to church twice a week and praying. That changed over time. It changed. I got deeply into religion, Christianity, until halfway through my walk, and then, you know, for me it shifted to more of a spirituality, more of a higher power, more of something, because I'd then been introduced to the 12 steps. Not sure if you're aware of the 12 steps.
No, reiterate. No, I'm
okay. The 12 steps is a recovery program for recovering addicts, whether that be gambling, drink, or drugs. And there are 12 steps to the program, and the first program is the self-awareness and giving yourself over to a higher power to say, please take over, help me, because I need some help right now and I can't do this alone. And asking for forgiveness, putting everything right, going out and helping. Everything that I was doing were part of the 12-step recovery program. And,
it sounds quite nice.
It's a great program.
Sounds quite peaceful.
It's fabulous. The great famous Russell Brand is part of that 12-step process as well. It's certainly a good process and has kept me well. I didn't go into a fellowship just quite simply because I was concerned about the whole codependency issue, meaning because I'm a former addict, it would mean I may be in with others that were staying there, and I didn't want to become stuck. So I used the coaching methodology of continually moving forwards and evolving as opposed to becoming stuck.
One last question on being homeless effectively, and everyone's worst nightmare, I suppose, is having someone walk up on you in your sleep or feeling unrest or unsafe. Did you ever experience any danger on the streets or violence?
No, I had those thoughts every single night because you can't obviously see out. I was extremely scared. So what I made sure is, even though I was in this very dark place, I made sure that I was safe. So what I would do every day when I walked into the town or city, I would go to the nearest police station, or I would talk to or wave down an officer, bizarrely, if they were driving past, and I would let them know that I was in their town and where I would be. So if anything happened, they knew who I was and where I was, because I believed at the time that rough camping was illegal, and so it couldn't be done. So I'd make sure that I would say to them, I'm doing this charity walk. Please, I'm just either behind your station or I'm behind a Tesco's. The funniest one that I put my tent up was on a golf course all the way down Land's End. I remember it was 11 o'clock at night. It was windy, it was cold, freezing. Temperatures dropped down to -4 on this walk. I'm surprised that I'm still alive. I remember pitching up on this pristine piece of grass. I thought, great, I'll put the tent here.
No way.
Put the tent up.
Sprinklers went on.
Yeah. Put it up. The very next morning I got up and this person's walking towards me and said, do you mind packing your tent up and leave it? I went, yeah, sure, yeah. Where am I? He said, Fistral Golf Course.
Newquay.
No
way, I know that golf course.
Yeah, it's a lovely course.
Yeah. That's hilarious.
What? Pitched it on Fistral Golf
Course. that's got to be a highlight, surely. That did make me laugh.
You know what? There's so many good news stories from that journey. I met so many amazing people. I met people that had nothing. I met millionaires that invited me to their house and stay at their house, but were lonely and were struggling. But I think what that whole journey brought about for me was the awareness of there's nobody above each other or below anyone else. We're all equal. Whether that level of suffering will only be different, and we all experience that in different ways. But we will all experience that at some point in our lives. You know, we know these statistics that say 1 in 4 people will struggle with their mental health over the period of a year. I actually think those statistics are nonsense, and they are statistics. I believe now that we all will, and it's not a case of if, it's a case of when.
I could not agree with you anymore. If you're human and you've got emotions and blood running through you, we are on a scale of 0 to 100, all of us. Everyone. Yeah. Whether you're tired and jaded or you're contemplating suicide at the other side, we're all on it. The sooner we can normalize that conversation and realize we're all in this together, that's when we'll start talking about mental health like we do the flu.
Gosh, yeah, absolutely true.
Now, so you're coming to the end of your walk. You're just about to finish that. I can't help noticing that you're no longer in a tent in the middle of a Fistral golf course. Dave, your backdrop is one that would make anyone envious, with this great orangery, a conservatory. How did you finish the walk, and how did you get to where you are today?
I finished the walk with, it was a bizarre ending, because I'd been gifted some tickets, 2 train tickets, because I put it on social media that I was doing the walk. Somebody gave me 2 tickets, train tickets, one to get me down to Land's End and one to get me back from John O'Groats back to Swindon. Now, there was a slight issue. The tickets were issued from GWR that do not operate in the north of England. So I was coming towards the end of the walk when I got quite a following by this point. About 10,000 people were following me on Facebook. And one of the people that were following me after I announced that I couldn't get back drove from Essex all the way up to Land's End to collect me.
Wow.
Brought me back, and I had nowhere to go. So I stayed with them, and it was a vicar and his wife, and I stayed with them for a short period. But this was 4 years ago. Only my journey was really beginning then, because it felt as if I was still running away and there was still things that I needed to address. And so this is when the coaching really began for me. This was when the recovery really started, when I stopped and started to face the music. Trauma therapy, that is when I went through lots of therapy. So the coaching, I went through mental health, first aid, adult and youth mental health first aid. To become qualified in that, I became qualified in suicide first aid, and then I built myself up to become a tutor in all of those. So I'm a tutor for mental health first aid. I'm one of only 100 tutors in the country for suicide first aid England. I'm also a coach, qualified in counselling, and I have many other qualifications. And the reason why I took those qualifications when I came back is because those were all the qualifications and all the interventions and therapies that helped me to where I am today. So now I work with organisations, global organisations, on keeping their staff well. One, not just with my story, but the insights I've gained through recovery into getting myself to where I am today. So quite right, as you say, going from a tent to living in the Cotswolds is quite a journey within a short space of time. Also, within that short space of time, I wanted to stretch things a little further. So I became a fully qualified pilot, private pilot within that short space of time as well, because it's amazing what people can do in recovery. And I think what people see when they've experienced a nervous breakdown or go through some, want to go back to what they did before, only many can't. So my experience within working within the NHS as an individual placement support team leader, and this was getting people back into work after experiencing poor mental health. Many of them thought that they could go back into the position that potentially caused the problem in the first place. But like myself, I couldn't go back into the corporate world. So I started studying mental health, and I started studying all the interventions and qualifying in the interventions that helped me. And now I use that experience and the academic qualifications that I've gained to help others.
It's funny, what we share as well is, well, it started because I went down, and I always vowed that when I got better, there would be a support network, in this case for the sales industry, and hopefully a lot more in the future. it is amazing how powerful it can be when you add your purpose with your passion, and you draw on this inner strength, which allows us to talk about our chosen subject without even thinking, because this energy comes from within that you can't get if you were selling something that you didn't want to sell, like you did in a previous career at the end of it, I mean.
You're absolutely right. But I think, it takes the coaching side of this to get you there, for you to be able to establish what your values are, what's important to you, what going forward is most important to you, and what lights you up. So I help organizations with keeping people well through a series of bespoke interventions, and the same interventions that I use, which are essentially wellbeing in the workplace toolkits that help people stay well, just through using basics. So, if I was to say, and I use this in many the trainings that I do, what keeps you well? People are stumped by that question. So then I reframe it to, okay, what do you enjoy doing? So if we look at what people enjoy doing and what lights them up, those things after work, like going for a walk, seeing the children, reading a book. Okay, so how often do you do those? Oh, I haven't got time for that. Well, those are the things that actually keep you well. So, but we forget about those because we're so engrossed in paying the bills or going to work or, feeding into a system that isn't necessarily making us or keeping us well.
Yeah, and I think that's what COVID will rearrange for a lot of people, because suddenly everyone's their own MD of their own environment and they're organising everything. Look, one of the points when I was drawing on my own experience, I found it very hard to give myself permission to be happy again. I was kind of comfy in the lull, and once coaching kicks in, and that third party, to me, it's just having a third party that you don't know to trust you with something and to question, why can't you do it? Because then it's like, well, I don't know, why can't I do it? Whereas when it's your family and friends, maybe you find that there's other reasons in your own head why they're asking.
Absolutely. And you're right with the family and friends. The family and friends, again, are unknown to the coaching model, but they know you who you are. And it's, if you change and you then become this person full of light and positivity and you move forwards, they say, oh, what's going on there? That's a bit odd. You've changed.
Yeah.
The acceptance of it, the acceptance is extremely difficult and can be for family, because it then makes them aware that they might have to change too. And change for families can be difficult.
So they might actually be, with all the best intentions in the world, it might actually be holding you back slightly, because as with all these things, it's through the eyes of which you see it, and it might be other people's intentions or insecurities coming in that might actually be holding you back. When we spoke before, I was out on a walk and you said advice is like, in those tones, you said advice is like bullets, because you don't want to take it. You don't want to take them, and so you sort of hide. And yeah, it just amazed me when you said that phrase, because that's what resonated with me.
And it is, that's the thing with advice as well. It's only advice from somebody else's perspective. Whether you take that on or not, it's, again, with the whole personal development and self-development. I know I've said it a few times. I was speaking to a friend about this morning. If it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for all the books, if it wasn't for all the seminars, if it wasn't for the understanding that I am in charge of my own destiny and my own life, I think I'd still be where I was today. So I'm grateful for finding it, even though it can also be a place that can potentially keep you trapped, because it makes you feel great. So you have to put boundaries around it. You have to set limitations. And I think using it up to a point is great, but you can easily fall into that bubble of personal development and self-development, especially if you've got an addictive personality. But if you suffer with addiction, it can be easy to latch onto something that makes you feel good.
So tell me, what has happened between the end of your journey for you to be sitting in a lovely big house like that? Because there are a lot of business people and people who work hard, and you've obviously done something very right since.
Yeah. And it was, I've worked hard since. I've worked hard since that day. I'd done something which I'd never done before, and it was actually saved money, and that was all very new to me. But I'm very reluctant to buy anything new. That old part of me that my dad installed into me. If you can upcycle, if you can recycle, if you can buy something in a charity shop, do that. And it's interesting because just before COVID outbreak, there was, I love visiting charity shops, and there were 3 sets of DVDs in there, and they were the workout DVDs, the Beachbody workout DVDs, Insanity, T25 and so on. They're only £5 each for 24 DVDs. Great, I'll have that, I'll buy that, and I'll do that. But I've been very careful with money and how I invest it now going forwards. Because I used to be a person that would live for today, so I was king for a day, pauper for a month. Now I met a wonderful lady that helped me through this journey as well 3 years ago, and she helped me get back financially straight and helped me understand money, helped me invest, and helped me reinvest back into my business. So all I do now is reinvest back into my business, invest to make sure that when I go out and teach, I'm teaching to the best of my ability, and also from the latest information. So I just reinvest in it, and so making sure that I'm delivering the best that I possibly can to the people that need it.
Great. And so your day job now is your business. Did you go straight into business when you finished the walk then?
I created the business straight off the back of my walk on a mobile phone. Was actually towards the end of the walk, I started this group called Mind Canyon. And the reason why I called it that is because the mind being a vast place, and so Grand Canyon too, and I thought let's amalgamate the two. And that's where I got that name from. And I'd created it back 3 years ago, but I didn't launch it till it was just over a year ago. And it was then that I'd started the teaching and the instructing, and yeah, it was there that it started.
Well, it's certainly got an authentic background, hasn't it? And your authentic background, which couldn't get any more authentic than it was, because you're right on the edge. You've now coupled that with extensive training and research and qualifications. Look, I'm taking up a lot of your time. I'm conscious of your time, but what I'd like to do is ask you a couple of definitions as well. If I could ask you now, after everything that you've been through and the material goods you've got now compared to sleeping on a green once, what is well-being?
Well-being to me is an all-round sense of being well. And so that is your mental health on the continuum, neutral. That is your well-being. And again, it's on the continuum being bad or good. It's somewhere sitting in the middle. Your ability to bounce back after, if you experience stress or depression through the day, if you experience bad news. But it's also your ability to contribute towards your community. So well-being and mental health is an all-round encompassing how you are feeling. It's not just about what's going on for you in your mind. Well-being is how you feel in general, what you're able to contribute, what you're doing in society, your purpose, your passion is all part of well-being.
Thank you. Everyone's definition is different depending on the circumstances that they've had in their life. So it's really interesting to get yours once you've had stuff and not had stuff. Stuff it doesn't sound like makes you happy. It's something else.
That's so true. You know what? When I look back at that time when I walked all of England and I had nothing, it was the most freeing time of my life. It really was.
Wow, that's powerful.
I had no responsibility. There was nothing. I feared nothing. I had nothing to lose, but I had everything to gain. I was having fun along the way. I met some amazing people. It was the most freeing journey and the most spiritually awakening journey of my life.
It sounds like you have a fond memory for it.
It's good. I often think I'd love to go back and do something similar.
And just before we wrap up then, if you could give from everything that you've experienced, from your brother and the tragic incident that happened then, from the lack of counselling with that generation, and then your walk, and then everything that's happened since, what's your one takeaway? What's your one piece of advice for someone?
My one piece of advice is, more so now than ever, is to reach out for help if you are struggling. because that help could change your life. You think, I like to think of it like this: it's where there's hope, or where there's hope, there's a way. Recovery is possible, and so is transformation. I'm evidence of that, and even taking the holistic approach, which is probably the longer way to do this. Where there's hope, there's a way. Recovery is possible, and so is transformation.
Fantastic, thank you. And what will people learn from your talks that they can take into their own lives?
That reaching out for help isn't a weakness, that it is a strength. And that, you know what, like I say, there's nobody above, or you're probably beating yourself up more than you need to. It's, you know, never be afraid to reach out for help.
That inner critic, isn't it, sometimes?
Absolutely.
Now, where can people find you? Where can people get hold of you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm now, just to make everybody aware that I'm now a mental health first aid tutor, suicide first aid tutor, mentor, and a coach and inspirational or motivational speaker. People can find me on www.mindcanyon.co.uk. That's the website. On Instagram, mindcanyonmh. On Twitter, mindcanyon mental health, and stevecarr.net.
Great. And look, welcome to the Wellity family. We will do everything we can to promote you to industries that need you most. You're an absolute inspiration. I've just sat in awe the whole time. The way you tell it, you normalise the conversation, which is everything that we're about. You make it very normal to talk about so that everyone else can admit and come out with whatever they face in their life. So look, from me and Wellity, I genuinely can't thank you enough. And we'll do what we can to help share your story.
Thank you, and thank you to your community.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you ever so much, Steve.
You're welcome.